Hi, I'm Kathy Aoki and welcome to my studio. I'm about to ask you a very personal question. Have you or a loved one ever not finished your beer and then the next day had to pour that wasted beer out? Well, those days are over. I'm about to show you how to upcycle your old beer into a watercolor monotype. It's going to be fun and probably profitable. Let's get started. A watercolor monotype is a kind of print made by creating a watercolor painting on a smooth piece of plexiglass that has been treated with a binder. The painting is allowed to dry completely on the plastic plate and then is transferred to a dampened piece of paper by using hand pressure or a printing press. Here are 3 reasons why you might want to try a watercolor monotype. Number 1, you're not super confident in watercolor painting. This process is forgiving because if you really screw up, you can wash off the watercolor and start over before ever transferring it to the piece of paper. Number 2, you enjoy the flat look of prints. The watercolor process that we're doing here looks different from a traditional watercolor painting. It looks more like a lithography instead. So if you like that flat graphic look, then I recommend this process. A third reason why you might want to try this is because you actually get more than one image from your painting. Most of the watercolor is lifted off in the first pass. However, you can usually get a secondary ghost print from the remaining watercolor. And a ghost print is very useful for making another drawing or can be successful on its own. For this project, I'm going to use some recycled old beer. In this case, the beer is dark and had a very foamy head to it. I recommend using beer that has a foamy head to it, or rather did at least yesterday, because it has more of the binding ingredient necessary to make this project successful. This project does not work well with watery, light beer. You'll also need a plate to print from. Here are sheets of plexiglass and acrylic, some of which were reclaimed from Ecology. I will degrease the plates with dishwashing liquid, but if you have a large unwieldy plate, you can also use rubbing alcohol or denatured alcohol to degrease your plate. To apply the beer to the plate, I will use a bowl and also a very, very clean sponge. The sponge is free of grease and any kind of contaminants. You can make reference drawings in advance. Anticipate with your drawing that your printed design will be in reverse. Since it's watercolor monotype, you're definitely going to need some watercolors. You'll also need a variety of brushes. For printing papers, I recommend hot press watercolor paper if available. You can also use regular printmaking paper or any kind of heavyweight paper that can survive being wet for 7 to 10 minutes and then have pressure applied to it. I find that when I use a toothier paper such as BFK Reeves printmaking paper, especially when printing by hand, then the watercolor monotype is more bumpy. But with a watercolor smooth paper like hot press, the watercolor will feel more continuous once I print it. To dampen the paper, I have a spray bottle, and to blot it, I will use a towel. I like to have clean rags on hand during the process. To print by hand, I will be using parchment paper as a backing, but you could also use newsprint or any other smooth paper. I will print by hand using this rice paddle that actually has Teflon in it. You can also use a flat wooden spoon, but it's a little trickier to get a consistent print. Optional tools for making a print include a credit card and printer, which you can purchase on eBay and modify, or an etching press. I'll start off by degreasing the plate with soap and water in a sink. Dry your plate completely when you're finished. As you can see from this demonstration, untreated plexi just simply beads up the watercolor into little blobs and thin little blobettes. So this is not very effective. However, if you've treated your plate correctly, the watercolor will remain flat on the plexiglass during the painting process. This is a beveled plate, so I'm cleaning and applying beer to the top part of the plate so the bevel slopes down away. So as mentioned earlier, I want to use a very dry, clean sponge so that there's really no liquid in here. if there is liquid, squeeze out as much as possible. Maybe even dry this in a towel so that when you dip it into your beer, the liquid that is infused into the sponge is primarily beer and not water. Squeeze some of the beer out. I don't want this to be super drippy. And then I'm going to apply it to the plate in even strokes, methodically covering every inch of the plate. Once you feel that your plate has been thoroughly dampened, then you can remove some of the liquid from your sponge. So now it's mostly dry. Oops. And then pass it over the plate in very quick, lightweight movements, hardly any pressure. When the plate starts to dry, it'll squeak a little bit. The reason why we're doing these last passes is so that the beer does not have a chance to puddle up during the drying process. So now it's done, and as I tip this in light, it's going to be hard to see, but there are no streaks on it and no little bubbles or anything. It was just a very even coat of beer. If I were to sniff this plate, it smells like an old beer, which is exactly what we just applied, so that's right. I'm going to let this plate sit for several hours. I actually prefer to let it sit at least overnight. In the meantime, I'll be working on a drawing, which you can just do on a piece of paper. You want to draw it in reverse, and then we'll be putting this drawing behind the plate to use as a reference on watercolor. Here I am dampening the paper with a spray bottle in a plastic tray because this piece of paper is small. This is my soaking wet sheet of paper that I need to blot. And so I'm going to fold part of the clean towel over it and just very light pressure. So now the surface looks dull, not shiny anymore. Here I am dampening a larger piece of paper in a printmaking lab, and the paper is being sandwiched between two pieces of vinyl in order to trap in the moisture for 7 to 10 minutes necessary to make the paper soft and pliable. I'm ready to print. What I've done also is kind of guesstimated what size scrap paper I'm going to use for this, and then I drew some little guidelines around the edges for myself. So I'm going to get on my plate. The first printing tool I'm going to use is a rice paddle. They also are made of bamboo. If yours is a little bit rough, then you might want to put a piece of newsprint in between your printing paper and your rice paddle. So I've got my piece of paper. Put a piece of newsprint on top, and now I'm going to rub with the rice paddle in small circular motions. I'm using one hand to hold the papers still while the other applies pressure, and I'm also feeling for all the corners of my plate. So I'm pushing quite hard. Then, to see how I've done so far, I'm going to just take a little peek. Now there's my print. Now it looks like I could do with a damper piece of paper. So I'm going to take my second piece of paper to print a ghost print, and I'm going to make this a little bit wetter right now. to dampen it again. Hand printing doesn't apply as much pressure as other methods, and so the results can be a little bit more textured comparatively. Now I'm going to put several sheets of backing on this. So this is a manila folder and several long pieces that will help guide the rollers over. The credit card imprinter applies more pressure than you can by hand, and so the texture of this print is smoother with more detail compared to my hand printing effort. Clean your plate off when you're finished with soap and water, completely dry, and then it's ready for another application of beer and watercolor. Thanks to Recology for making this video possible. I hope you enjoyed learning about watercolor monotypes, and I encourage you to recycle your beer. Thanks!